Jen and welcome to my channel. On my channel I make videos about personal growth in neuroscience, and now I want to start talking more about counseling theory on my channel because for the past 2 years I've been working as a mental health counselor. So that's been an exciting new development and definitely in line with the passions that I've had for mental health, personal growth, and neuroscience ever since 2012. And especially recently I've been reading some really interesting books on counseling theory. So I felt like now is a good time to maybe start sharing some of them on YouTube in order to help me articulate better what I've learned from it and to also share that with you guys, of course. So a book that I read last summer that I found fascinating was Family Evaluation by Michal Kerr and Marie Bowen. So Bowen created the theory of family systems theory, which essentially takes into account the whole family unit as opposed to just an individual in counseling. So an individual comes in, they have symptoms, and previously people would just focus on that person. What's going on with them? Is something wrong with them biologically? What happened in their childhood that's made them this way? But Bowen Family Systems takes into account not just the individual, but also who are they interacting with on a daily basis? How do the people in their life affect how they are? How did the dynamics they grow up with affect them, and how are those dynamics happening in the present? I think one of the first things that kind of made me realize how much the systems thing is important is kind of looking at how roles that people play in different dynamics, and how when you're in that dynamic with different people, you change as a person. So for example, a really important common dynamic to look at is the pursuer-distancer dynamic. So let's say we're talking about a romantic relationship and one person is the pursuer, and as they pursue, the other person becomes more distant. They're annoyed by that constant pursuance, and they pull away. And then that pursuer increases more pursuing behaviors because they can feel that their partner has moved away. Well, if you take that same pursuer and put them in a different relationship where maybe they're with someone who pursues even more than them, then they can start to become that distancer person and take on those qualities of moving away just because they're with someone who pursues so much. So it's not so much that someone is always a distancer, that's who they are, but who they interact with impacts who they are. Bowen introduces a concept called differentiation. Someone who is highly differentiated is control of their own emotions. They're not so impacted by everyone around them. If people are judging them or if their partner's mad at them, they can still self-regulate and kind of choose how they want to feel, and they don't blame others for what they're feeling. Whereas someone who is very poorly differentiated is very affected by what others think of them and is constantly, their emotions are controlled by how other people feel about them. In romantic relationships, people generally attract people who have a similar level of differentiation than them. So people who are poorly differentiated often attract other people who are poorly differentiated, and they really merge together. Whereas two people who are highly differentiated can both live their own separate lives while also maintaining their relationship and kind of being in control of their own emotions while being in this relationship. And interestingly, usually the family you come from, you're about the same or around the same level of differentiation as your parents, as your siblings. Maybe there's outliers, maybe things can change over time, but with all else equal, if you haven't necessarily done a lot of therapeutic work, you're going to be at a similar differentiation of the family that you grew up with. But going back to couples, I want to look at this image. So A shows two people who are very poorly differentiated. Their emotions are very overlapped. They rely so much on each other for their emotions. In B, they're also quite poorly differentiated, but have a little bit more differentiation than A, so they're not fully merged with each other, but they still are quite dependent on each other's emotions. Whereas if you look at D, the person on the left and the person on the right, square and the circle, are completely differentiated. Neither of them are dependent on the other person's emotions or what the other person does at all. So if one partner is angry, the other partner is just not affected. They can regulate themselves and kind of control themselves completely. Whereas in C, this is a kind of more realistic level of differentiation where both partners have their own lives, can control their emotions quite a bit, but are still sometimes affected by each other. And I think even Bowen acknowledges that there is never going to be people who are 100% differentiated from each other. It's kind of just like, in his eyes, a goal. For me, actually, I don't know if I think it's ideal to be fully separated from the partner and like fully not be affected by if your partner is going through something. But I still have found learning about Bowen family systems very interesting, and this idea of differentiation is very important. I just don't know if I agree that 100% differentiation is the ideal. But it is also important to note that as you learn about differentiation, it can kind of sound like, oh, or is it just like people who are avoidant? Is it that they're so separated from other people that they're not impacted by them, and that's what differentiation is? But Bowen does go into explaining the nuance and difference between that. He would actually say that people who are avoidant are actually quite poorly differentiated because their actions are still very dependent on what another person is doing. If their partner is emotional and asking for support, someone who is avoidant might completely, avoid them, push away, take actions to get further and further away from that partner, and that is not showing that they're not impacted by those emotions. They're actually very impacted by those emotions, and they're not in control of how they respond to it, and they have their fear response of moving away. Whereas a differentiated partner can be there with their partner while their partner is experiencing these difficult emotions and be a support. They show up for what is best for everybody, not just what is best for their fear and running away, but rather they can actually be with you. So differentiation does not look like emotional distance or physical distance. It's actually does have more closeness and more connection and more genuine empathy. But when people are poorly differentiated, they're not really able to fully empathize with their partner because they are so caught up in their own emotions. So in the case of both a highly anxious partner and a highly avoidant partner, both of those types of partners are poorly differentiated. They have anxieties and fears that are triggered by other people and by their partners. Whereas someone who is secure and differentiated can show up in a healthy way to any response and, be there for their partner. So it might be obvious, but in relationships where both people are poorly differentiated, there's not a lot of room for balance and flexibility in the relationship. Rather, the relationship is quite rigid. Both people are very dependent on what is going on with their partner. They're very sensitive to each other. They'll fight very often, but with fighting very often though, they're also so dependent on each other that they're not going to leave each other. So even if they're in a toxic relationship, they need that other person. Even if they hate that other person at times because they are fighting so much, they're fighting so much because they care so much, because they rely so much on that person, because they won't be okay if they don't have that person. That person is how they regulate their emotions. On the other hand, if you think about it, in a couple where both people are very differentiated, neither of them are relying on the other person to regulate their emotions. There's going to be less fights. People can kind of regulate themselves, take responsibility for their own emotions, maybe communicate clearly about what emotions they're feeling, and then their equally differentiated partner can take in what they're hearing, not be super defensive because they're not destroyed to hear if their partner is disappointed in something, but rather they take the feedback and regulate. Obviously, this is very probably not super realistic. Nobody is perfect. Nobody is fully differentiated. But the more differentiated you are, the more you are able to take in other people's perspectives, listen to your partner. I think, it's in every relationship, there'll probably be people who you're impacted by something your partner did, but the more differentiated you are, the more you're able to communicate it clearly. You're able to give your partner a chance to explain themselves. You're able to bring it up in a way that your partner can just respond non-defensively, and your partner will likely also not be a super defensive person if you're highly differentiated, because you attract people of similar levels. Bowen also introduces this concept of anxiety. So I think anxiety has so many different definitions. I'm not talking about generalized anxiety disorder. Anxiety, what Bowen is talking about, is kind of like stress in the system. So any system can have stress in it. There can be a couple who is highly differentiated, and there can be stressors in life that create stress in the system. And same for when there's a poorly differentiated couple. So also like make up an example right now, but like let's say someone's parent dies, someone's dad dies. In the highly differentiated couple, this experience happens. One partner is just completely distraught, crying a lot. Let's say that they're not 100% differentiated. Let's say they're 90% differentiated. So the wife is crying, she's upset, she lost her father, and her husband is definitely sad to see her going through this, and he wants to be there for her as much as he can. So he offers support, and he is definitely sad to see her going through this, but he doesn't let his sadness overtake him. He is more focused on helping her with what she's going through, and he's really there for her. On the other hand, if you look at a super poorly differentiated couple, wife loses her father, she's devastated, and then her partner is so fused with her emotions that he can't handle seeing her this sad. It makes him so depressed that she's so sad, and he tries to help her, but he's also crying, he's also like having his own existential crisis and like worrying about his parents dying. He just is overtaken by it all. There is anxiety in both systems, but in the less differentiated couple, that anxiety magnifies and creates new anxiety, and it just creates this like snowball of anxiety and overwhelming emotions. Whereas in the highly differentiated couple, there's a lot of anxiety, especially in the wife, and the husband is feeling some of that, but he is there to care for her. So his anxiety doesn't get to this point where it's worsening her anxiety or making her feel worse. He's able to contain his emotions, regulate some of his own anxiety, and help this person who needs the help. But yes, when anxiety is in poorly differentiated systems, it can take a lot of different forms, and that's actually the really big kind of key thing that Bowen has found, is that he finds symptoms to be kind of where anxiety of a system is put into one person. So Bowen actually started out as a psychiatrist, and he was studying people with schizophrenia, and he was working with them for a while, not seeing a ton of changes, or he would bring one person with schizophrenia into the hospital, they would be cured, but then they are like, treated, managed, they would be functioning well, but then when they returned to their family, their schizophrenia would come back full blown. So he saw this and he was like, there's something with the family that is related to this, because when this person is not with their family, they can function just fine, but when they're back in this family system, all these symptoms come back. So that's when he became curious and started bringing the full families into the hospitals. And he saw qualities in these families that were different than any other families he had ever seen. So he noticed, for example, he would call the mothers, usually schizophrenic mothers, like he saw that they were extremely overly anxious, overly attentive to their kid, kind of panicked all the time. And I think it's definitely of the time that more of this responsibility was on the mother, just culturally, and maybe that's not necessarily okay, but This was like in the 70s, so he was mostly more focused on the mothers than, like, let's say the fathers, but he really saw this difference in the mothers of people with schizophrenia. And of course, this is probably so many factors go into this. If someone has schizophrenia, if someone's child has schizophrenia, of course that's a stressful situation, and of course the mother has to be super attentive and stressed and on top of everything. So is it the schizophrenia that causes the mothers to act this way, or the mothers being this way that created the schizophrenia? He's not saying it's one way or the other, but he is saying that how the mother is acting does create those symptoms to come back, even though they were gone when the symptom was alone in the hospital. So regardless of where the chicken or the egg, it matters that how the mom is acting in the system. So his theory, in a way, is that any mental health disorder is caused because there is a system that probably has poor differentiation. Thus, when there's anxiety in the system, the anxiety does not go away. The anxiety gets placed into people in the system or relationships in the system. So it's going to look like so many different symptoms that Bowen explains in this book. But for example, there's that schizophrenia one. So that's saying, like, let's say mom and dad have tension in their relationship and they're poorly differentiated, so they can't handle this stress. But instead of healing the core issue of the anxiety between the two of them, they've focused all of that anxiety on their child, and then their child becomes a symptom bearer and may develop schizophrenia or anxiety or any sort of mental health issue. Bowen believes that it comes from this anxiety that is projected on them from the system and onto them. And that's a really common concept when it comes to, like, scapegoats. Like, I think a lot of people know about this idea that maybe there's one kid in the family that just gets blamed for everything. And because all of this negative anxiety is focused on them, they do end up doing more poor behaviors because everyone expects it of them. Everyone is treating them kind of rudely, kind of manifests the stereotype. When I first heard about this theory, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. I think that there are mental health disorders that exist that are biological, that they're real. Like, especially even schizophrenia is a very highly genetic disorder. But then you have to take into account what his research saw. So even though schizophrenia has this huge genetic component, the symptoms are greatly affected by the family. So I think family systems explains a lot about how symptoms come out. You can have a disorder and function poorly with it or function well with it. And I think that's where the family comes in. Sure, there's like this genetic baseline, but the symptoms coming out is in relation to the context that that person is in. And family is a very strong context. And I think that changed how I see things quite a bit. I still believe in mental health disorders, but I want to know what's going on in their family, in their relationships, because the symptoms coming out, it's not just because they have this disorder, but because of the context that they're in. Another way that anxiety can be dealt with in a system is something called uneven accommodations. And this was fascinating to me, and it kind of explored this idea that the couple is both people in the couple are poorly differentiated. Let's say they're both 10% differentiated. They have 10% control of their emotions, but pretty much a lot of it is focused on their partner. This can be the case, but the two people can seem to be functioning very, very differently. And it's very common in relationships for one person to make a lot of kind of identity and personal sacrifices for the relationship. And once they become the person in that position, they keep kind of giving up self, giving up things, and their partner, they gain self, they gain things because their partner is willing to do what they want to do. So let's say the boyfriend wants to move across country and the girlfriend doesn't really question. She's like, sure, I'll go with you. He gets to kind of do whatever job he wants to do, and she will have to figure out a job and figure out something in the location that he has chosen to go. She has less power, less control over following the exact mission or thing she wants to do, and he gets to do exactly what he wants to do. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's more differentiated than her, but they just ended up in this dynamic where he's making those decisions and she's okay with going along with it. I think the movie The Marriage Story encapsulates this really well. But this dynamic of uneven accommodation often leads to another very common dynamic, which is called the overfunctioner and the underfunctioner. So let's picture the same couple. They've moved across country. Boyfriend's doing whatever job he wants. Girlfriend's figuring out, adjusting, trying to make something work wherever he needs to be. But then she starts to get depressed and she begins to underfunction. She isn't going after her passions in the same way that she would if she could really be wherever she chose to be. And then let's say the depressed partner stops doing their chores in the house, and then like because they're depressed, they just don't cook, don't clean, don't do these things, and then their partner is not feeling depressed, they're feeling quite liberated, they're doing whatever job they want, they feel bad that their partner is depressed and they don't know how to deal with that, they don't know how to fix that, but maybe they pick up the chores, pick up the cooking and cleaning. And over time, they also start to become kind of stressed and overwhelmed, and they hate that they're doing all these extra chores or doing all these extra things. And they resent their partner, and then their partner feels that resentment, and that pushes them even further into this depression. They do even less, and that cycle of overfunctioning and underfunctioning continues and worsens to the point where eventually that underfunctioning partner, I mean, in some cases, I've seen people on just go on disability. It gets really hard for them. They're very severely depressed. And it's not easy to be the person in that underfunctioning position. They truly feel terrible. So neither person in this dynamic, the overfunctioner is stressed, the underfunctioner is debilitated. It's not good for either of them. But it started out with this person giving up their self, giving up things to follow their partner around. They can't even consider leaving their partner because their emotions are so dependent on their partner. But then it's gotten to this place of neither of them are happy, but still neither of them can leave because they are both dependent on how the other person is feeling, even though at that point both of them are feeling terrible. But neither of them, especially the depressed partner, she does not have enough self to go leave and do something. She hasn't done anything for herself in a very long time. She's not really going anywhere. And then this male partner who has been doing everything, he got a lot of self kind of loaned to him from her moving to where he is. So he created this self that he didn't necessarily have naturally, but got through having her support. But if he lost her, that would destabilize. He wouldn't have this inherent, kind of safety that he got from having her. And typically, when these types of couples do eventually break up, it kind of really changes, the underfunctioning person becomes much higher functioning than they were when they were in the relationship, and the higher functioning person becomes lower functioning because they don't have that same role as someone who their partner will kind of follow them ever, do whatever they want. And even like when that partner was taking care of their partner when they were suffering, that actually gave them a little bit even more self, gave them like this idea that they are the strong person, they help people. But when they lose that, and then they go back to this, they kind of go more back to who they were before that all started, and they're not necessarily a hero anymore, and they don't have someone following them everywhere, and they're more alone than they were before. Anxiety can look like in that form, like you mentioned, like a schizophrenic child has taken in the anxiety of the system, and that symptom comes out in that way. We also talked about how anxiety can create this uneven accommodations where one person gives up self for the other person and then becomes quite under-functioning, and then they bear the symptoms in that way. But there's also a million different ways that anxiety can be bound. So I thought this paragraph explained that in an interesting way. So it says personality traits such as obsessiveness, hysteria, impulsiveness and indecisiveness, passivity and aggressiveness, shyness and obtrusiveness, procrastination, perfectionism, paranoia, grandiosity, optimism, and pessimism can also serve as anxiety binders. A moralist can bind as much anxiety by persuading others to live a more moral life as an immoralist can bind by resisting others' attempts to reform him. Temperance can bind as much anxiety as indulgence. The idealization and romanticization of people, places, and activities can bind anxiety. Undervaluing self can contribute to a person's sense of well-being by reducing the person's expectation of himself. Undervaluing others can also contribute a sense of well-being by fostering feelings of superiority. So this kind of shows that things that look like opposites are still different ways to bind anxiety. It can be in any manifestation of things. And keep in mind that this is what will happen to people who are more poorly differentiated. They will cling on to just these different external things for their control, their emotional regulation, whereas people who are highly differentiated, they don't need to cling so tightly onto perfectionism, or they don't fall into procrastination as much. Like they're not as controlled by whims of addiction or holding on to rigid beliefs. So this goes to show that anxiety can look like so many different things, and really the factor of it all is just how intense they are. So how intense it is that someone has to make all these rules and make sure everyone's following rules, and their whole sense of anxiety or calmness relies on what's going on externally. Are people following the rules that they believe so passionately in? Whereas someone who is differentiated, you know, they can regulate themselves. Of course, maybe they want people around them to be doing the right thing, but it's not going to destroy them to see that. These were all concepts from the first half of Family Evaluation by Michael E. Kerr and Marie Bowen. And I read this book last summer, and I had wanted to make a video on it since last summer, and I just had not gotten around to it. But I took a lot of notes, so these were all notes on like that first half of the book I took. And now maybe I might reread the second half, retake those notes, but I felt like there was so much information there, and I just have to kind of get it out there, because if I take notes forever, I'm never going to make a video, I'm never going to share it. And in making this video, sometimes I'm like, isn't so obvious, like that differentiation and like having emotional regulation skills? Like, of course that means it's going to be a healthier relationship, but at the same time, like I still have my mind blown by like that study on schizophrenia and like seeing just how much people are affected by family systems. So I hope that this is as interesting to you as it was to me, because it's like obvious in a way, but I don't know, I think it still changed the way I see things. So I think it's definitely worth sharing and talking about and exploring. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and let me know what you found interesting about this, if there's anything in particular you want to hear more about. I hope to come back on here sometime soon and maybe finish the other half of this book or talk about other books, and of course maybe more neuroscience research, because I love doing that as well. I'm busy doing work as a therapist, but I love learning And then once I learn, I think it helps me learn so much more if I share the content on here. So I do hope to do more of that. And I just find this stuff so interesting and so exciting. So I hope that some of you find that interesting too. All right, bye.